The person who taught me the most about fearlessness and the reason to be wary of it is someone I didn't get to speak to directly. She's a really famous research subject who's known only to the public as patient SM. And neuroscientists have been studying her for a few decades. She has a rare disease that caused brain damage to her amygdala, which is the brain structure that sort of triggers our fear response. And hers doesn't work. It's offline. It's been offline since she was about 10 years old. She can remember being afraid before she was 10 years old, but she hasn't had a fear reaction in the normal sense that we think of it in the decades since. She's truly fearless. She's had a gun held to her head and didn't flinch. She's been assaulted, and she's had actually a really tough life. And that's the lesson, is that it's incredibly dangerous to be truly fearless.
That's Eva Holland, and this is the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. I'm Ben Catania, your host. This is my show where we go long form and learn more about the world and ourselves through the lenses of risk and uncertainty. Now, if you've listened to the show for any length of time, you will know that one of the topics that tends to come up time and again is fear. Now, that's not surprising, of course, because fear is often associated with risk and uncertainty. And today we talk about the science of fear, and we do that in a great way with our guest, Eva Holland, author of a fantastic book called Nerve, a personal journey through the science of fear. Eva is a freelance writer. She's based in Whitehorse, which is in the Yukon territory in northern Canada. She's a correspondent for Outside magazine and has been published in the likes of Bloomberg, National Geographic, Wired, and many more publications. Now, in 2015, Eva was forced to face her greatest fear when her mother had a stroke and suddenly passed away. After her grief subsided, Eva began to explore how her fears may have limited her and whether or not it was possible to move past them. And this led to her deep dive into the science of fear. She looked at where phobias come from, how they differ from trauma and anxiety, and whether we can find better ways to feel afraid. We get into all of that in this episode. We talk about the different types of fear, what Eva learned. She gives some insights into what happens to people who have a rare disease that prevents them from feeling fear. We also talk about people like Alex Honnold, the famous rock climber, and how someone like that processes fear, and much, much more. So let's dive in. Let's get into it. Here is Eva Holland. Eva, welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on. I've been looking forward to this for some time, so welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben.
So to begin with, I think it would be useful for my listeners for you to give a little bit of a background as to who you are and then kind of lead into your reasons for writing this book.
Sure. So I'm a freelance writer. I write mostly kind of magazine feature stories. This is my first book, Nerve, and I live in the Yukon territory in northern Canada. And kind of by virtue of living here, I fell into writing a lot about outdoor adventure and extreme sports, wilderness travel, that sort of thing. I'm a correspondent for Outside magazine in the United States. And I came across a problem in both my career and my personal life here. I moved to the Yukon about 12 years ago, and the things my friends do, you know, they play outside in the mountains. That's kind of what there is to do here. And I hadn't really realized I was afraid of heights until I moved to more mountainous country and started trying to, hike and mountain bike, sort of stuff, and discovered sort of belatedly that I've actually been sort of avoiding heights my whole life without entirely realizing it. So I've been dealing with this fear of heights that is sort of a problem for an adventure writer and also a problem personally living here in terms of my social life. And I also, over the course of my time here, had a series of car accidents in winter weather, black ice and hailstorms and things like that, and developed a pretty significant fear of driving in icy or sort of slippery conditions, which again is a problem living here with 8 months of winter. So I has sort of, I had this stuff swirling around in my mind in the last few years about fear and about phobias. It took me a while to understand that my fear resulting from the car accidents is sort of a variety of fear that we call trauma. And wasn't quite sure what to do with this stuff other than, find it personally inconvenient. And then in the summer of 2015, my mom died really suddenly from a stroke. And she had been, I was really close to my mom, probably a little bit unusually so for sort of your average adult. And I had grown up with her telling me about losing her parents when she was young. She had been an orphan. So I had really grown up with this fear of losing her the way she had lost her parents. And when she did die, it was sort of like my worst fear had come true, which was sort of an interesting thing to think about for someone who was thinking about fear and my relationship to it already. And ultimately, I wasn't, for a variety of reasons that I get into in the book, I wasn't sort of deeply harmed by my mom's death in the ways that she had been by the losses of her parents. I was really sad. I had an intense grieving process, but I wasn't, they call it a complicated grief when you have sort of a really sort of messy aftermath of a loss. And I didn't ultimately experience that. I was sort of, sad, but otherwise okay. And that about 6 months after she died, I thought, gosh, I've now just survived my worst fear and come through the other side, and I'm going to be all right, sort of to my surprise. And that was really a strange, empowering moment. And it came at the same time as I was dealing with sort of a couple of crisis points in terms of this car accident situation, and the heights thing was sort of coming to a head. And I thought, maybe there's something I can learn through this. Maybe I can face my other fears and survive them too. Maybe renegotiate them, maybe, overcome them. And that is what led to the book project, sort of thinking maybe the sense of empowerment from coming through the loss of my mom can help me understand the rest of my fears and sort of tackle them.
And did you set out to write a book, or did you originally set out to just explore your fears?
Originally, it was just going to be kind of a personal project. I had the ice climbing scene that opens the book caused this sort of personal crisis where I said, okay, this is too much. I had a serious panic attack on an ice climb and really for the first time endangered myself and my friends rather than just sort of embarrassing myself. And that was sort of okay, now it's time to deal with this. And I envisioned it as a personal project, but only for a couple months. Pretty quickly, I thought, there's probably a book in this that some other people might find interesting.
Yeah, it's a fabulous book, and there's so much in it that I think is really useful to anyone. We talk a lot about fear on this show, and I guess one of the things to maybe distinguish, you do a really good job of it in the book, is to just define what you mean by fear and distinguish it from, I guess, anxiety or dread. And then you also paint a nice little picture of, phobia, trauma, and then existential fears, because you discuss and then you get into the trauma side and you also deal with your phobia. But before we maybe get into that, like, how do you explain fear or define it for the purposes of the book that you wrote?
The best definition that I came across was from a 19th century American psychologist, and he called it the anticipation of pain. Fear as the anticipation of pain. And that I thought was so apt in all sorts of contexts, whether that means, literally the, anticipation of pain, like I'm going to fall off my bike and scrape my knees on the sidewalk, or I'm going to lose the people that I love and be devastated, or, I'm going to get hit by that truck. It sort of works on all different levels. So I thought that was sort of a perfect catch-all definition of fear. And it explains a lot of how much of our fear can be sort of future facing, thinking about things that could happen, classic sort of anxiety, sort of catastrophizing. But it also, it's about our memories too. because we anticipate pain based on what we've learned in the past about what causes pain. So I found that a really useful catch-all, and then sort of went from there into thinking about the different sort of subcategories of, trauma, phobia, anxiety, and related to anxiety, the sort of existential, big picture fears we have about our lives and what they'll look like and what they mean.
Yeah. And I guess we all have exposure to all three of those things in one way, shape, or form. But let's talk a little bit about the phobia piece, your fear of heights, and how you set about addressing it. Because I think that's interesting, and there's a lot. Obviously, there's a lot there. But first of all, where you describe where you think it comes from, and then you go on, a sort of exposure therapy, I guess, self-design program maybe. And when, you have a very nice little passage about facing your fears, because we hear that a lot. It's like, face your fears. And it's a nice, it's a nice example of what that looks like and the strengths and limitations. So I'd love to get into that a little bit. And maybe if you just start, fear of heights, where does that come from? And then just maybe paint a little bit of a picture for someone who hasn't maybe read the book about how you went about looking at that.
Absolutely. So I'm not 100% sure where my fear of heights comes from. It's very much a fear of exposed slopes, exposed heights. So it's, I'm fine in elevators. I'm generally fine on balconies and bridges as long as the railing seems sturdy. Mine is all about, people's phobias vary. Mine is all about a sense of exposure that I can fall. So ladders, even like a small step ladder, steep hills, this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I did fall down an escalator at an airport when I was 3 or 4 years old. And I remember that pretty clearly. So that's, one possibility of sort of an early childhood experience that may have shaped my sense of fear of falling. But they have all sorts of ideas about where phobias come from. There's some evidence that they may be hereditary. And I found out in the course of working on my book that my dad was afraid of heights when he was younger. He used to have these recurring dreams that he was falling off a mountain, apparently, when he was a kid. And there's some evidence that it's related to what we call our vestibular system, that people might be more likely to be afraid of heights if they have if they have an overdependence on visual cues to move through the world. So we have all sorts of ways of sensing the world around us when we move, right? And people who overly depend on visual cues as opposed to other cues might actually be more likely to fall when their sense of the horizon is askew the way it can be when you're at heights. I found one paper to suggest that it could be sort of a physical problem. And that felt relevant to my experience as well, because I always just feel so clumsy when I'm off the ground. I feel like completely disoriented and like I'm going to fall. And so there's a few possibilities, but I to try to fix it. And I had this idea, as you said, of facing my fears. It's a very big part of our culture to say, you got to look your fears in the eye and stare them down or whatever the case may be. So the first thing I did was sign up for skydiving. I had this idea that I could sort of smash my fear to bits if I did something extreme enough, like I would just break through the wall and then everything would be okay. And, it turns out that's not how facing your fears works in sort of the clinical sense. It did not help, I would say. I did it. I made it through a jump. I sort of voluntarily left an airplane in mid-flight. But it didn't change anything for me. And what I learned as I dug deeper into the science is that it's not about gritting your teeth and doing it in terms of a long-term solution. It's about, retraining your brain to avoid the panic in the first place rather than forcing through the panic, because the panic is like a groove that's been dug in your brain and this pattern that you just fall down again and again. So you have to build a new groove essentially by remaining calm. And so I did this DIY version of sort of a more classic exposure therapy where I tried to use rock climbing as a venue to sort of train myself to remain calm. And so the classic version of exposure therapy would be if you're afraid of elevators, you would first just go and stand and look at an elevator in the lobby. And then you might go and sort of like advance 2 steps towards the threshold. And then the next day and so on and so forth until you're standing in the elevator and it's moving, but in very, very small steps. And you only ever go as far as you can without panicking. And then you try to get 1 step further next time. So I did attempt to sort of DIY something like that with very basic rock climbing with some friends who were more experienced, and it was somewhat successful. I was able to make headway. It was really hard work. It's slow work, but it was satisfying to be able to feel that sense of building a new tunnel, that isn't the very familiar falling down into panic that I knew so well. And then the third thing I did was more radical. I did an experimental drug treatment in Amsterdam for phobias, and I won't say too much about that, spoilers wise, but
sure.
But it was a more radical approach than the gradual exposure therapy.
Yeah, I love that. I love that section of the book, and I don't want to put a spoiler out there, but you got a little bit miffed at a camera crew when that was going on, and I just so. This is a show about risk and uncertainty, and I'm a risk management professional. And so in my day job, we're always trying to think about the probabilities of things and, the consequences if those things were to occur and, all that kind of stuff. And fear obviously is not, there's an emotional and a physiological element to it. So I just love that. Please, if you don't want me to give spoilers, but you went up this thing a second time and you felt a little bit afraid and then you got miffed at yourself and at this camera crew. And then it's like, well, but wait a minute, there were some probabilities that this, there was some reason to be afraid. And so that's just kind of a natural, not just natural, but sensible, reasonable. Whereas, what you're trying to deal with is the irrational, like where the phobia, the fear diverts from, an objective reality of the probabilities of something going wrong.
Right. That's the whole dilemma is how do you sort of parse rational fears and anxieties from irrational ones, and where's the line? And of course it differs for different people, but the psychologist in Amsterdam said the challenge that her clients have after the treatment is figuring out when it's reasonable to react, because they're so used to their fear being unreasonable. And so you have to almost learn to trust yourself again. In situations where you should respond to fear. It's an interesting balance. I think that's sort of the central dilemma of human fear is like, when do we listen and when do we squash it down?
Right. The other thing I wanted to touch on, because it's also a fascinating thing, is that sometimes, we talk about that rational brain, but, fear, as you describe in the book, is also there's a physiological element to it, and you can't really detach the rational thinking brain from some of the physiological responses. And I'm just wondering what your, takeaway from that was, or was there anything that was surprising about that? Because I think it's something we don't give enough credence to, especially when we're trying to deal with uncertainty. I come across this, there's sort of 2 ways in which people advise others on how to make decisions. And one is, make a list of pros and cons and calculate the odds and da-da-da. And then, the other more extreme one is just go with your gut and, all this kind of stuff. And one is more emotional and one is more sort of rational. And the thing that we fail to understand is that this is all part of a continuum. The physiological and the rational are they're interconnected.
Mm-hmm. I found that so illuminating. I hadn't fully realized that until I started my research on the book, that, for a long time, scientists and philosophers, because the line between those two didn't used to be so clear, they believed that the emotion came first, that you would, let's say you see a bear and you say, that's a bear, I'm frightened. And then your body's, fear response would kick in. All the things we know, your pupils dilate, your chest constricts, maybe you get goosebumps, your hair stands on end. And so the feeling was, or the belief was, that that the physiological response followed from the emotion. And what they now understand is that actually our physiological response operates on a deeper level than our conscious mind, and it happens faster. And so what actually happens is you see a bear, your conscious mind hasn't even registered the bear yet before your pupils dilate, your chest constricts, you get goosebumps, and then all that feedback gets sent to your brain, and your brain says, hey, look, we're having a fear response. We're afraid. Which sort of seems counterintuitive, but then when you think about it, you think about all the times when you've felt uneasy or afraid, and you sort of look around being like, I don't feel right. What is causing this? And you have to look around for the source because you haven't consciously registered whatever it is yet. So that was really just enlightening for me to sort of get put the horse in front of the cart and understand, because that matters so much in terms of how we deal with it, because you have to address the physiological response in order to make any change in your emotional response.
And in dealing with that phobia, is that part of it? Because I'm not a psychologist or neuroscientist, although all this stuff is fascinating to me, and I know that you aren't, but you dove into the research a fair bit. But is that a little bit about what needs to happen to navigate kind of a phobia, panic attack type situation, is to kind of notice the emotions rising, some of those physiological things, and then to take control? Is that what you took away from it, or is it a little bit different? Am I missing the mark a little bit with that description?
I don't know if it's exactly about taking control as teaching your body a different lesson about when to react with fear. And so what I was doing with the rock climbing was trying to go so slowly and so carefully that I never tripped that physiological response. And giving the physiological response, the subconscious response, giving it different data to say, this is not a threat. This is not a threat. We can do this. This is okay. And to sort of change what trips, what the tripwire is for that response. Because it's very difficult once the physiological response has started for you to sort of emotionally throttle it back and talk yourself out of it. And so the idea is to try and kind of change the physiological triggers through either slow work or through more dramatic interventions, like some of the other ones I do in the book for both phobia and trauma.
Right. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about trauma as well. And you mentioned your car accident history. I was actually quite taken aback by the number of near misses and cars rolling off of highways and things, and so those can be, I'm sure, very traumatic. Like you describe being upside down with strapped in by your seatbelt, and to me I was like, oh shit, that's never happened to me. So maybe I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience with trauma, and again, the same kind of lens around the physiological side of it. And you mentioned this book called The Body Keeps the Score, I believe, about trauma being held in the body, and that's also fascinating, again, to the point of mind-body connection. But if you could just talk us through the trauma side of fear, that would be really interesting, your journey there.
Absolutely. It's still a little, I find the number of accidents that I have to admit to, I still find it a little embarrassing. So I've been in 3 rollovers. I've rolled 3 vehicles upside down into the ditch off the highway. And then the 4th accident was being hit by a truck on the highway, an oncoming vehicle who came into my lane, and I wasn't quite able to get all the way out of his way as he sort of barreled into me. So it was, I did avoid a head-on collision in that instance, but it was a full sideswipe and sort of, a matter of inches between what happened and a full speed head-on collision with, a car and a truck. So it wouldn't have ended well for me. And that was the one I think that had the most sort of emotional impact, because I realized that I had almost died. And that was something I sort of had to deal with. But I didn't know very much about trauma, and I didn't even know how to put a name on it for a long time until I started working on the book. But I had one of the accidents was in high school and didn't leave a hugely lingering effect. But the truck hit me in the summer of 2014, and then I had the rollovers in January 2016 and April 2016. And so those three kind of came one after another. And after that, I found I would be having these flashbacks when I was driving. I would sometimes hyperventilate. I would feel as though the car was going to roll again, or that I thought every car coming ahead was going to hit me. I would have to pull over and sort of shake and cry sometimes. It was this really powerful reaction that I couldn't control, and I couldn't talk myself out of, and I didn't understand. And it took a long time for me to sort of call it trauma, because I've since learned this is really classic, even for the people that I was thinking the term belonged to. They also don't sort of accept it either. Somebody else has always gone through worse, right? And so I didn't think, I had some car accidents where, I was really lucky not to be physically injured seriously. What do I have to complain about? People get trauma, when they go off to war. But it turns out, the people who go off to war also feel like they don't have enough to complain about because someone else was more deeply injured or lost more friends, so there's all these people walking around feeling like they're not entitled.
Sorry to interrupt you on that thought, but I think the body doesn't really know the difference, like, the context of whether, I'm in a war or I'm being chased by a machete wielding madman or whatever. Like, the body doesn't really have that filter to, parcel out the context. And so presumably all that stuff doesn't matter. If the body feels trauma, it feels trauma. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Yeah. The body just knows that there's been, a threat, a deep, deep threat to its well-being, to its safety. And it's, and there can be fallout from that for months and years for a lot right. I lost the thread a little bit.
Apologies. You were talking about the series of car accidents, and actually, as you were describing those, I was wondering about whether or not, and you mentioned how they were sort of in quick succession, at least within a few months. And sometimes I wonder whether or not one contributes to the other. So somehow you think, oh shit, this is happening again, and somehow you do, you subconsciously get yourself in the same thing. I'm a cyclist, for example, and sometimes you get stories of some riders are kind of crash prone, and you just wonder if there's something going on there. Yeah,
I think there could be something to that for sure. The last one in particular sort of felt inevitable. It was sort of like this doom that I was driving towards, and I sort of felt it happening, and I actually said, not again before I rolled, but I lost control. And I don't know if maybe there's something I could have done to recover control if I hadn't sort of felt like, well, here we go again,
And would you say that the treatment for those things, or the understanding of it, where is the similarity with something like a phobia or an anxiety and, the trauma side of things?
It's really interesting how much of it across all these things is related to memory. That's why I said that about fear being sort of future facing, but also sort of driven by our past earlier, is in the same way that you have this sort of rut in a phobia that you have to get out of your physiological response. You sort of have to get away from these memory patterns with trauma in order to avoid, sort of spiraling into flashbacks and that sort of thing. And there's a whole bunch of different, treatments available for PTSD and trauma. And I don't, like to endorse one over another. I think lots of them have different things going for them, and it's a matter of people finding the one that works for them. But I did one called EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it sounds really wacky. The therapist prompts you to move your eyes back and forth from side to side while she talks you through what happened, and you sort of, my experience of it was very physical, which makes sense given that we keep talking about sort of the physical nature of the fear response. I could sort of I could feel the sort of the tension and the trauma moving around in my body, and it was very, very strange experience. Another maybe my favorite quote in the whole book is a woman who survived the Oklahoma City bombing in the United States and did an EMDR in the aftermath. And she said EMDR was the strangest thing she'd ever experienced, with the exception of the bomb. And I just thought that was so great. It's a very, very odd experience to sort of feel this harm sort of ricocheting around your body. I know that sounds really woo-woo. That's not my thing at all. But it was like my memories of the car accidents were files sticking up out of a filing cabinet drawer, and I couldn't close the drawer. And so when I was driving, these memories would be sort of front and center in my mind, and I'd be panicking. And EMDR does something to sort of put the files away correctly so you can close the drawer. And that's what trauma treatments do when they work, is they let us close the drawer on these, they call them intrusive memory.
Right. Did you, in the course of your research, come across the use of psychedelics for trauma?
I didn't come across a ton about that. I know it's very much out there, and more so every year. I think it was sort of still a little more marginalized when I was starting out my research, 5 or 6 years ago.
Right.
Michael Pollan hadn't done his book yet, and really elevated kind of the discourse to a larger audience on that.
So, okay, I want to talk about fearlessness, and let me give you my favorite quote of your book, and it's actually a quote of one of the psychiatrists, researchers that you had interviewed, and it's basically this: it's because the ideal Navy SEAL is not someone who is fearless. Ideally, you want somebody who is very good at identifying threat, but doesn't identify threat where it doesn't exist. And I highlighted that. And that's one of my favorite quotes of your book. And I want to explore fearlessness a little bit, because we hear this term a lot. You need to be fearless. I hear it a lot in business: fearless leaders, fearless organizations, blah, blah, blah. And I think what a crock of shit, because there's, you don't, to your point in one of your chapters, you don't want to be fearless, right? There's a utility in fear. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about fearlessness and what you learn about fearlessness.
Absolutely. I love that quote too, because it's one of those things that makes perfect sense when you think about it, but it does upend some of our sort of cultural stereotypes of who the bravest people, or the sort of most, the most desirable way to be is to be fearless, right? But what she found was that actually it's about making the right call. And that there's not a great deal of difference. The brain patterns of reckless people and anxious people, like unreasonably cautious, anxious people, are similar because they're sort of mirrored images of each other. And the ideal is a happy medium where you identify threats correctly and respond proportionally. So that was really interesting to me. And the person who taught me the most about fearlessness and the reason to be wary of it is someone I didn't get to speak to directly. She's a really famous research subject who's known only to the public as patient SM. And neuroscientists have been studying her for a few decades. She has a rare disease that caused brain damage to her amygdala, which is the brain structure that sort of triggers our fear response. And hers doesn't work. It's offline. It's been offline since she was about 10 years old. She can remember being afraid before she was 10 years old, but she hasn't had a fear reaction in the normal sense that we think of it in the decades since. She's truly, truly fearless. She's had a gun held to her head and didn't flinch. She's been assaulted, and she's had actually a really tough life. And that's the lesson, is that it's incredibly dangerous to be truly fearless, because fear is a survival mechanism. Fear is about learning from bad experiences. It's about sort of setting down maps for ourselves of how to navigate the world. And she's sort of operating without guardrails. And so really unexpected things too. She's bad with money because she has no fear of consequences. She sometimes forgets to eat. She has trouble maintaining friendships. And it's not because she's a jerk. It's the opposite. She's apparently really kind, really warm, but when she likes someone, she comes on too strong and sort of scares them off because she has no fear of rejection and no no sense of boundaries. Like what a thing to be. I don't think anybody enjoys social anxiety and going like, oh, do they want to hang out with me? I want to hang out with them. Oh no, that's a horrible feeling. But it turns out that if you really don't have it at all, it makes things really hard.
Right.
So she really helped clarify my sense of the value of fear and that we do want to find this happy medium of appropriate fear rather than fearlessness. I'm very skeptical of fearlessness.
Yeah, and you have that other quote that I guess it's an Albertan saying, there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots, which I love too.
Yeah, we say that up here too.
So I think it's really important to understand that fear has a value, has a utility, and then we can sort of use it to our advantage. But I suppose, it becomes problematic when we let it run our lives. But similarly, as you say, fearlessness is, I wouldn't want to be sitting next to or being driven by someone who's fearless or being led by someone who is truly fearless. I think most of us wouldn't.
Yeah. Similar to the pilots thing, I remember I worked with quite a young helicopter pilot a number of years ago, and I remember my cousin saying, "No, I don't want a young helicopter pilot. I want somebody with kids and a mortgage and a reason to come home at night."
Right. Yeah. You also mention Alex Honnold in the book, and I think he's a fascinating person, and we've spoken to people on this podcast about Alex Honnold, and so this patient SM versus Alex Honnold. So Alex had I think it's a scene in Free Solo where he had his brain scanned, and they're saying his amygdala isn't necessarily firing or whatever. What's the difference between? Because there is a difference, but if you could explain the difference between Alex versus patient SM, that I'm curious about that.
Absolutely. So Alex's amygdala works. It just seems to have a higher threshold to trigger than most of us, particularly in this area of, being on a cliff. I think he has more normal fear responses in some other respects, in other contexts, but his amygdala has a vastly higher threshold to fire that physiological fear response than most of us would have, which is what enables him to do what he does. Versus patient SM, whose amygdala doesn't work at all. It's offline. It's calcified is the phrase that the neuroscientists use, and sort of almost perfectly. There's other patients with her same disease or Vaquita who have sort of partially calcified amygdalas, and hers is sort of, the margins are kind of perfect, like a surgeon had sort of cut it out perfectly. It's still there, but it doesn't function. So when we talk about what I was trying to do with my little rock climbing effort, I was trying to shift my threshold a little bit towards where Alex Honnold's is. But of course, I might have moved mine a meter and he's, several kilometers further along.
And I suppose, if Alex's didn't work at all, he'd be dead.
Yes. Yeah. If Alex's, that's, and patient SM is in her 50s and she's very lucky to still be alive. Most people with that condition, it's very rare, but most of the few people that we know of with that condition, they don't live long lives. And yeah, if Alex Honnold had no sense of self-preservation, if he did what he did, but without the extreme care that he takes, I don't think he would have survived to this point. It's still, partly luck, that he's made it as far as he has. And I hope he continues to survive all his endeavors.
And he is I would say he's very calculated if Free Solo is anything to go by, in that, he studies the difficult parts of the rock face and, reviews and practices and so forth. It is calculated risk taking. It may be a different tolerance or appetite for risk, but it is calculated. Yeah.
I would say he very aggressively manages every element of risk that he can in these things. The only thing he can't control is, if a piece of rock breaks off or if he has an enormous sneeze at the wrong moment. But I think he seems to be very rigorous in controlling every variable that he can.
Right. can we talk a little bit about anxiety? You don't have necessarily let's talk about it because it's so much fun, right? But let's, I think it's something that all of us deal with on a regular basis, some more than others. But I think that, and particularly now, we're not post-pandemic, but, given the pandemic, et cetera. And, you talked about, the fear of losing your mother, and then it, sort of came to pass. And I'm just wondering how, would you say that you had that anxiety about what happened to your mother, and then post that, would you say that your anxiety went down even because you had a situation that came to pass? Or I don't know if you had any thoughts on anxiety versus, versus trauma and phobia. Like trauma, obviously very acute, but anxiety, worries about the future and maybe existential things and things like that. I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on what you learned about anxiety through the book.
Yeah, there was a period of time after my mom died where I had sort of heightened anxiety about everyone else around. I had sort of heightened anxiety about everyone else around me, potentially dying too. I was really worried about my dad for a while. I had this feeling of like this intense vulnerability of, this happened once as kind of a bolt from the blue. It could happen again any day now. Anything could happen. And I found that really destabilizing and anxiety inducing. But as time went on, I got to a more peaceful place of saying, well, okay, how to grieve, experience deep grief. There are things about it that are valuable. There are things about it that are hard. You know how it works now, and you come through the most intense period of it, and you can do that again in future. You will lose people in the future, and you will navigate that when the time comes. You will be wrecked for a while. You will get support from your friends. You will, and sure. So I got to a much more kind of Zen place, I would say, and then the pandemic hit. And I rapidly got less Zen, but as I think many of us did. But I always had these very narrowly focused anxieties, I would say. I had anxiety about my mom, and then I had anxiety about my dad. And I hadn't really experienced the more general anxiety that a lot of people do. And I didn't totally understand it, which is part of why I don't address it as broadly in the book as I do phobia and trauma.
Okay.
I felt like phobia is really like anxiety through a really narrow lens. Like when I was on a cliff edge trail, I was always expecting the worst with every step and sort of gaming out the potential catastrophes. And I think now that I've lived through a year and a half of a pandemic, I have a better sense of what that's like for people who experience a more generalized anxiety and see the potential harm, the anticipation of pain around every corner, and how hard it is to control those thoughts. And I got, like a lot of people, I got a dog in the pandemic. And I just worry about him all the time. I'm like, is he going to get hit by a car? Is he going to get eaten by a bear? Is he going to, run away and never come back? Is he going to eat something he shouldn't and choke to death? Is he going to get an intestinal? Like this constant refrain of concern about the dog. And I'm sure that's, I'm sure you could analyze that as like me focusing my concern about everything going on in the world onto this little dependent creature. But it's been interesting to sort of learn more after the book was finished about anxiety, and I felt like I had come to this really healthy place by the end of the book. And it's been interesting to see, like, no, this is going to be a lifelong project of kind of managing these thoughts and fears and anxieties.
Right. Well, I think it's, congratulations, you're a human being kind of a thing. And we all experience that, right? Like, as you were talking about, I mean, one of the things so I lost my father to pancreatic cancer in April, and for the...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. So I've just been, going through grief. And then when you talk about in your book, the panic attack on the, while you were climbing the ice climb, and for the few months after losing him, I was not in my right state all the time either. And so I think one of the things this is a really complex topic around, fear and phobia and so on, but when we're trying to get to that sort of Zen-like state of those Navy SEALs or whatever, but we're not always there. Something's going on, or we're tired, or whatever. So we can't always make the best call, and that's totally understandable. But again, we live in a society, we're being asked to make decisions using just kind of our rational brains, and that doesn't always cut it. Often it doesn't.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm gonna take that with me, I think, and try to be less hard on myself sometimes.
Sure. Yeah. So at any rate, it's a really fascinating topic because we all deal with it. And I guess through the process of writing this book, have you taken away any big lessons around how you approach uncertainty and any, major decisions?
I think a big thing for me was letting go of some of the sort of shame and sort of guilt feelings that I had around being afraid. I was really embarrassed, I was really, really embarrassed. And what I learned when I went back to write these scenes of the times when I panicked, there was a continuity between almost all of them of feeling embarrassed if it was happening in front of people, and then getting worse and worse, like sort of the panic or the spiral being compounded by embarrassment, which was sort of illuminating to see on the page and be like, wait, every time there was someone watching me be scared, I got more scared and more upset. So letting go of some of that shame, I think, has been helpful for me. And part of that is understanding, the necessity of fear and that it is a survival instinct and not this sort of thing to be crushed and defeated and, crushed under your boot heel, like we talk about sometimes in the culture. So I think that's been kind of liberating for me. And then, the magic of it is if you're afraid, then your reactions are less extreme and you're sort of able to navigate things more freely. Yeah, that's been really helpful for me.
Right. It's a thing to be integrated, isn't it? Rather than squash, because you can't squash it anyway. It's always there.
Yeah, I think of it as trying to have a healthy relationship with my fear rather than, overcome or defeat, which is the notion that I started out with of like, I'm gonna crush my fears. But now it's more like, let's build a healthy partnership.
Cool. Well, it's a wonderful book, and I think I highly recommend it to all of my listeners. In terms of future projects, where are you turning to now, or have you decided that, or what are you thinking about?
Yeah, it's not 100% certain. I have a lot of unanswered questions about neuroscience and the brain from delving into neuroscience for nerve, but not being able to go as deeply as I might have liked into some fascinating, sort of alleys and rabbit holes and things in my research. I think I'll probably do some magazine stories about neuroscience in the near future to sort of follow some of those trails that I didn't get to pick up for the book. And I'm hoping to do another book soon too, and I don't know exactly what it will be yet, but I'm thinking about something about kind of latecomers to the wilderness and outdoor adventure, because I only started doing this stuff in my late 20s. It wasn't something I grew up with. And so maybe something about what it means to get into that stuff later in life and how we can do it and why it matters to be able to access, the outdoors, even if you didn't grow up camping and hiking or whatever else. Maybe something along those lines I think would be interesting. Yeah,
that would be fascinating. I'd be very interested to read about that as someone who didn't grow up. I grew up in a city, so there's nature in terms of parks, but not necessarily like what you're talking about, where where you live. Just out of curiosity, how did you get to being in the Yukon? Like what led you there?
Yeah, it was kind of a funny, I had started freelancing. I was back in my hometown of Ottawa after grad school, and I had started freelancing, and I was just sort of casting around for a new home base that wasn't my hometown. Being, having the option to live anywhere in the world as a freelance writer in my kind of mid-20s, I was like, well, it seems crazy to just stay at home. And so I have a cousin here in Whitehorse who's about my age. He shows up in the book a few times. My cousin came to visit him in the summer of 2009 for a few weeks. And then I just said, yep, this is it. And moved up here a few months later. I've got my 12th Yukon anniversary coming up. And it was so different from anywhere I'd ever lived. I'd lived in cities always as well. And I was not this outdoorsy, sporty person particularly. I played team sports, but not done, all these wilderness sports. But I just fell in love with the community and the lifestyle, and been here ever since.
Cool. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. Was there anything that you wanted to mention that you think is relevant that you don't think we got a chance to cover?
I don't think so. I guess I would just say, if there are people listening who are kind of struggling with phobia or trauma or anxiety or anything else, these things felt permanent to me. They felt like a part of my body that would be completely immutable. And to be honest, when I started the book project, I didn't think I would make any significant changes in the way that I exist in relationship to my fear. I thought I'd be writing this kind of mushy epilogue that says, well, I didn't cure my fears, but I sure learned a lot along the way, and but it all ended up being so much more changeable than I ever imagined, and my quality of life is higher because of the work that I did for this book. So if that encourages anyone to try to see if they can make some changes in that relationship, that would be great.
And just to touch on that a little bit more, I mean, if somebody did want to start to explore their own fears a little bit beyond reading your book, what do you think would be a good small first step?
I used a book called The Anxiety and Phobias Workbook when I was sort of doing my DIY exposure therapy. It had more than just exposure therapy in it. It had a lot of different approaches. So that might be worth checking out. The Body Keeps the Score is well worth reading. And, professional help is not accessible to everyone, but if you are able to access, counseling or therapy, I didn't feel like what I was dealing with was a big enough deal. I was like, oh, I'm not, I'm not, traumatized enough to sort of spend this money, but it, nobody's going to laugh at you if you ask for help with a fear of something that seems trivial, your fear of chickens or something, this is stuff that the mental health professionals take seriously. So if you're in a position to seek out their help, I'd say do so.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So the book is called Nerve, A Personal Journey Through the Science of Fear. If people want to follow you and learn more about your other work, where are some of the best places to do that?
Yeah, I spend more time than I should on Twitter. I'm at Eva Holland on Twitter. And I have a very out-of-date website at evaholland.com that does have a lot of my, earlier work on it, but I don't think I've updated it since the pandemic. So it's a bit out of date, but it does have some of my earlier stories and things.
Excellent. Eva, this was great. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me and to my listeners. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks for a great conversation.
All right, I hope you guys enjoyed that and found it insightful. Do check out Eva's book, Nerve, A Personal Journey Through the Science of Fear. It's highly readable. It's a great account. Links are in the show notes as usual. And of course, give Eva a follow. And as always, please share the show, because if you've enjoyed this episode, chances are others would too. And this always helps us out an awful lot. We will be back very soon. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.